You are listening to Training Matters with Honey Shelton. Training Matters is brought to you by the Training Institute, dedicated to setting the standard for individuals responsible for training effectiveness in banks and credit unions across the country.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to have Beth Guard back as my guest for this episode of Training Matters. To just refresh your memory about who the wonderful Mary Beth is, she is very instrumental in the creation and expansion of Bankers Online. And she has launched BOL conferences that are held around the country. She is the director of bankcompliance.com, which is the premier subscription-based compliance service that's offered online. Mary Beth is a friend and an expert, and I'm really happy to have her here today. Hi, Mary Beth.
Hi, honey. Thank you.
What I thought we'd talk about today is, what's the compliance forecast? And when I say that, Mary Beth, I kind of want to open the door for you to talk about things that could be a compliance risk or even a legal risk that are pretty hot topics right now. So where would you like to start?
Well, let's start with regulatory rollback, because I think when bankers think about the compliance forecast, what they want to know is it going to rain down a whole bunch of new regulations, or is the flood that's already occurred going to subside somewhat? And there was a bill introduced in Congress that passed the House that would provide significant regulatory relief for all but the largest institutions, particularly on the loan side, but really all across the board from things that were imposed by Dodd-Frank. It passed the House and passed the Senate. They can tweak it later. They can make further reforms in the future, but I'm very hopeful of meaningful reform. The next thing I want to talk about, honey, if it's okay with you, is kind of the new climate that exists with relation to privacy of personal information.
Oh, I think that would be right up there with what our audience wants to hear.
Well, what I see happening is an increased sensitivity to the subject that our information is out there, and that might not be the best possible thing. For a while, it was a trade-off. Most of us were willing to give up an amount of privacy in exchange for convenience and in exchange for other opportunities. For example, you might use your real name on your profile on Facebook because you want people who are childhood friends that you've lost contact with, or people of that nature, to be able to find you and to be able to reconnect. But recently, when the data analytics scandal broke in the news, and we learned that people who use Facebook, who were doing certain kinds of quizzes and games and things, were not only giving access to their information, but they were also giving access to information of their Facebook friends. A lot of people drew a line in the sand and said, it's gone too far. So what does that mean for you? Well, as a financial institution, you are the repository of some of the most sensitive information about a person. So their loans, they've given you their financial statements, their tax returns, and so forth. So it means it's time for you as an institution to reinforce your training on all matters relating to privacy. So that goes back to the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Privacy Act and the rules, and the prohibition against sharing non-public personal information of your customer with non-affiliated third parties. It goes back to the FACT Act, which has the prohibitions against use of medical information. It goes to the Fair Credit Reporting Act provisions about sharing information with affiliates. It goes back to doing retraining on your information security program, your red flags program that's designed to detect, deter, and prevent and mitigate against identity theft. So you want this to be fresh in the minds of all your employees, because there are more methods than ever before for parties to gain access to information that our customers don't want them to have access to. And these laws, these programs, these policies that you have in force in your bank are standing between the want-to-get information crowd and your customers' protected information. So you want to be able to show that you've done everything you need to do, and it might be time to update those programs. Also, when you look at the Equifax breach that made public the information of millions of Americans, or the Yahoo breach that affected 2 billion people, you realize, okay, the threats have changed, and therefore we need to do a new risk assessment for our information security program. We need to do a new risk assessment for our red flags program, because knowing what we know about the kind of data the hackers have gained access to helps us understand how they can use that information to try to more effectively impersonate our customer or would-be customer and take over their identity. So in this era, with the enhanced sensitivity to the need to keep private information private, I would place a premium on reinforcement of training.
Wow, Mary Beth, that is timely and so obvious. Financial institutions that follow us will heed your warning. Is training up to date, and when's the last time we ran risk assessments in light of all these new breaches and threats? There's 2 other things I want to talk about with you while I have you captured today. One, I want to talk about the wells-fargo story that doesn't seem to end. And then I'd kind of like to talk about what you call pay equity. So I'm just going to hand you the mic, and I want to hear what you have to say about Wells and how big that got. Then,
the Wells debacle is kind of the gift that keeps on giving, and I use the word gift in the most negative possible light, because it was and it remains a huge black eye for the financial institutions industry, because it suddenly caused customers of financial institutions all across the country to ask themselves whether the trust they placed in their financial institution was naive, whether it was misplaced, whether the financial institution had earned that trust. When you find that a financial institution's employees have lied, that they have resorted to subterfuge, that they placed keeping their own job or earning incentive bonuses ahead of doing the right thing, it shakes the foundation of trust in the banking industry to its very core. And the institution was so well respected prior to that time, but it just flushed all that down the toilet in its go crazy with growth mode that led to a culture of We have to hit the numbers at all costs. And every financial institution should examine itself in light of what happened at Wells. And, the first scandal that broke with Wells had to do with opening accounts for people without their knowledge, signing up for debit cards in the names of people that had not asked for debit cards, and online banking and so forth. But then there were some subsequent reports after that time of other instances of fraud and deception that occurred in other areas of the bank, from force-placed auto insurance on down. So it piled on to the story and reinforced the belief that the institution itself had a very deep problem, a pervasive culture of do whatever you have to do to get as many dollars into the bank's bottom line as possible. So every financial institution needs to look at what they're doing in the way of incentive pay and ask, is this something that is going to incentivize bad behavior? Is it something that could tempt someone to cross the line? Have we married the training about cross-selling to sufficient training about ethics? Have we chosen our people properly so that when they come into the institution, they aren't the kind of person who would be prone to telling untruths or to doing things that are not legal or are not ethical? And the monitoring and the supervision. You have to look at, okay, if something were going wrong in my institution, for example, if there was collusion between an appraiser and a loan officer, or if there was something going on that just wasn't quite right, what mechanism do we have in place for that to be reported? And if bad behavior pertains to someone in a position of power, is the reporting mechanism one that would allow the reporting to occur without fear of retaliation? In large institutions who are bound by Sarbanes-Oxley to have whistleblower hotlines, the whistleblower hotlines presumably fill a need. But as we saw with Wells-Fargo, that wasn't necessarily the case, because they had a whistleblower hotline, but it wasn't resulting in the bad behavior being identified and stopped there. And in small institutions, you may not have a hotline at all. You may just have a process where if you have something that you have learned of that is not right, you report to Betsy, the vice president, and then she investigates. But take a look at your processes to make sure that they take the fear out of reporting, because you want to know at the earliest possible point in time, we have a problem, and we need to deal with it before it becomes systemic in any way. Am I surprised about the total fallout from the Wells debacle? No. Heads have rolled. Heads will probably continue to roll. The bank has shrunk. The bank will continue to shrink because people have to take a leap of faith to take their business there now. And frankly, I think they'll have a more difficult time attracting quality employees also, because saying, yes, I work for Wells doesn't have the same cachet that it had even 5 years ago. I want to talk about one other thing quickly when we're talking about new sensitivities and new ways that people are looking at things, we need to think about pay equity. The banking industry is not exactly known for having a lot of diversity, for having a lot of equality. But back when they had to bring Christopher Plummer in to take the role of Getty in the movie All the Money in the World, when Kevin Spacey became disgraced and they knew that they couldn't sell a movie that starred Kevin Spacey, well, they brought Christopher Plummer in to take over his role, and some of the other people in the film had to come back and do reshoots. And two of the people were Mark Wahlberg and Michelle Williams, and they played roughly equal characters in the film in terms of their screen time, their importance to the movie, the level that they could attract fans. Michelle Williams, of course, had already won an Oscar. Well, when they brought him back for reshoots, Mark Wahlberg got paid $1.5 million for reshoots on the film. Michelle Williams received about 1/10 of 1% of that sum, an $80 per diem that totaled less than $1,000. So this lopsided payday was exposed. It led to other lopsided paydays being exposed, not just in the movie industry, but elsewhere. In the case of Wahlberg and Williams, Wahlberg ended up pledging to donate his wage windfall to the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund that fights against sexual harassment and sexual abuse. I don't know if he's ever followed through with that or not. But, honey, I believe you heard a person who was high up in the FDIC, very well-respected female who had examined lots of banks over the course of her career, and she made the comment that never in all of her examination reports that she participated in writing had she written this sentence about a female bank officer: she makes too much for her work. And, of course, some of you may be with financial institutions who have seen comments like that in your exam report where it's pointed to a male employee and it said he makes too much. In the banking industry, that doesn't happen with females, not because of anything other than typically they're not paid in the same way. So with the new sensitivity to that, you have to look at the fact you have different risks to consider. One is you've got compliance risk, the risk that examiners are going to criticize something. This isn't the kind of thing that the examiners typically stick their nose into, but you also have legal risk. And what I'm saying to you today is it's time for bank management to do an analysis of the job functions, duties, qualifications, work output by different people within the institution and try to ensure that the compensation is done purely without regard to gender and solely on the basis of merit and what the work is worth.
Well, Mary Beth, I love how candid you are and how qualified you are to really speak about what's hot, what's going on, and what the forecast looks like. We always love having you as our guest. When you're on, it's one of the most frequently listened to programs, just like this one will be. So I want to thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Well, thank you, honey. It's always a pleasure.
Everyone, join us again next month for another episode of Training Matters. Thanks for tuning in today.
You've been listening to Training Matters with Honey Shelton.